All right, what is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another day of SaberSim's DFS office hours. Today is Thursday, February 12th of 2026. Looking ahead here, we had PGA tee off earlier this morning. Good luck to all of you playing some golf for the rest of the evening. We have NASCAR duels getting underway soon, and then we have a 3-game NBA main slate, the last NBA main slate before the All-Star break. So should be a fun day of DFS. For those of you who are new here, welcome. My name is Andrew. I'm one of the coaches over here at SaberSim. This is a show where we go over how to use the SaberSim app, answer any and all DFS-related questions. Get your questions in one of three ways here. First off, send us an email, support@sabersim.com. Second, post it live in the YouTube chat. Third way, post it in the office hours channel in our Discord server. If you're not in our Discord and want to get access to that channel, there is a link in the description of this video. You also get access to our similar channels, individual sport channels, and you get access to the rest of the SaberSim team. Just can't say enough good things about the Discord. But with that said, we do this show Monday through Friday, 4 p.m. Eastern, and then we do this show on Saturdays at 12:30 p.m. Eastern. So you can tune in any one of those days to get your questions answered. All right. With that said, let's get SaberSim pulled up on the screen. We did have a number of questions come in prior to the show today, so we will start there and then just kind of see where things go. So first question today. Hi, Andrew. After building and simming a group of lineups, is there a simple and efficient way to match ownership to exposure for the purpose of generating a custom set of field lineups that can be saved, i.e. the inverse of match exposure to ownership? So I asked for a little bit of clarification on this question, but I think I kind of understand the premise, and I kind of want to talk about this and kind of walk this backwards a little bit. So it's important to remember that the ownership, so it sounds to me like what the user is trying to do, okay, is they want to build a set of lineups. And we're just going to build 500 lineups to kind of show this. So they're saying after building and simming a group of lineups. So, hey, I'm running a build and I'm simming it. Is there a simple and efficient way to match ownership to exposure for the purpose of generating a custom set of field lineups that can be saved? So what they want to do is saying, hey, these are my exposures from this build. I want to take the exposure and I want to send the exposure to the ownership column because I want to generate a field using the exposures as the ownership. Okay, so what they're doing is like they're building some lineups, and then we're going to wait for exposures to populate. They basically want to take these exposures, put them in the ownership column, and then generate the field from there. The problem, the hardest part of this, and the part that makes this the most challenging, is that the exposure column is not downloadable. Like when I click download and I open this file, there is specifically not an exposure column. So that makes this kind of harder to do. The part I want to talk about is, I don't know if you're trying to do this from like a subset of lineups, like, oh, I want to do the top 150, for instance, right? If you're trying to do it this way, what you may need to do is like effectively build something. I would probably try ChatGPT, where I upload the player file like this one. So I download the projections. I upload this to ChatGPT in like a project. And then I download the lineups, the raw lineups, which would be this lineups file. That'll look like this. And then I would tell ChatGPT, hey, effectively calculate my exposures to each player based on player ID, assuming each row is a lineup. It should return the same exposures for the players. And then what you can do is you can take this percentage. You would basically have something that's like name and then the exposure, and then you would change this to ownership, and then you would upload that as an ownership projection. That is probably the easiest way I can think, like quote unquote easiest. It's kind of cool to use ChatGPT and like get familiar with new stuff. If you've never used it before, I think it's cool. So that is the one way I would consider doing this. Now, the other thing to mention is that if you're not trying to use a subset, you're like, actually, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to use the exposures of all of the lineups in my field. Well, that's a slightly different question. So the reason for that, and this is important to remember. So like when I go to the contest tab and I go to a field, right? And I pop it out. So right now I'm looking at the flagship MME column, or the flagship MME set of field lineups. Okay. So notice the exposures here, right? LeBron is 50.8% exposed. Well, when I look at his ownership, and I'm going to confirm this. So I'm looking at the flagship MME ownership. Okay. When I do this, and my camera died, but it's okay. I finally figured out why that's happening right before the show. So I'm actually happy it lasted this long, but camera will be good going forward. The exposure here, right, in the flagship MME field. Well, look, it matches the projected own. The only difference is projected own is 2 decimal places and the exposure is rounding to 1 decimal place, right? The exposures in the field, the pool exposures, mind you, are the ownership projections, okay? So if you think about it, if you run a build and you're like, hey, I want to use these exposures as the ownership, right? Well, the pool exposures effectively would be an ownership set, right? Like if I brought this pool over, what is happening in the flagship MME is that these pool exposures are the ownership projections. So you don't need to set the ownership to the pool and generate a field. You don't need to do that. All you need to do is say, hey, within my contest sim, I just need to change the field lineups to the build I was using. And then now the pool exposures are the ownership projections. And then what happens, right? Let's say this is a 150 max contest. We're going to take your lineups, which would say be in build 2, right? You're going to run a new set of lineups that are like quote unquote yours. So these are yours. These are your custom field. And then we're going to take your lineups and then put them up against all of the lineups in that build 1. If your contest is smaller, right? Let's say we built 5,000 lineups, but I'm playing a 1,000 man contest. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to take a random 1,000 from the 5,000 and then put that up against your 150 in the example that we gave. So if you're trying to use pool exposure, you don't actually have to do anything different. If you're trying to use a subset of exposures, such as like the top 150 or something like that as the field, then you're going to have to do something different, like we talked about here with exporting, calculating the exposures, re-uploading it as custom ownership. So that is what I would recommend there, depending on the avenue that you are trying to go. So hopefully that helps. And provides a little bit of insight into how that all works. All right, next question. When running multiple contests, what group option would be the fastest to run? I usually do 1 group per contest, but sometimes it can take a long time to get through all the sims and diversification. Last night, my late swap took forever and was wondering how to be fastest, especially when we get late news things. Okay, so I don't actually think one template is faster than another. I've never like tested this. I've never like ran different templates and, timed them to see which ones are fastest, because it's going to be the same number of contest sims and the same number of contests that it needs to diversify. The only thing that I could imagine is that when you use one group per contest, it'll say like 0 out of 2 diversifying, for instance. But if you use direct fill, it'll say 0 out of 1 diversifying because it's only diversifying the one group. However, it still needs to diversify all of the contests within the group. So yeah, there's only one group, but there's, 5 contests in this group, right? So I don't know time-wise if that's actually faster or not. I'm sure you could test it and find out, but that would be something that I would be concerned about is, or that'd be something I would be thinking about, like, hey, is this actually faster or not? As far as like the situation you found yourself in, like, hey, my sims and my diversifier are taking a long time. I think it can be really good to have what I would call like a fallback template where it's effectively a template that has nothing to do with sims and diversification in case you find yourself in a time crunch. And what I would do is, honestly, like this projected sorting one we were talking about yesterday, I would probably just create something super simple that says, hey, create a group for all of my contests where set the numbers to my entries and diversity uniques 1. I probably wouldn't use projected score personally. I would probably just use Saber score, honestly. So this is what I would call like a good fallback template. And we'll just call it Saber score sorting. So the Saber score is always going to be calculated for you. So at any point you could switch templates. This will give you a good sorting metric. It will give you one group for all of your contests, and it will effectively ignore sims and portfolio diversification in the event you are in a time crunch. So I think that this is probably a worthwhile template to just have for like a worst case scenario type of thing. But if you want to try, if you're using one group per contest, it's possible direct fill could be faster since it diversifies less groups. So that is probably what I would recommend is both of these things, right? Direct fill could be faster, but have a good fallback template that will ultimately allow you to still swap while saving time. All right. Next question. 1 second. All right. Next question. What will be the advantage and disadvantage of using all contests in one group versus group by contest or vice versa? Following up, if I have to choose one by default for portfolio plus scenarios, which shall it be? Thanks. Okay. So another template question. I do not want to give the impression, because I think frankly, it's wrong that one template is better than another. I think that's incorrect. I think each template is of equal strength, but serves a different user or a different type of process / strategy. There's nothing that says like, oh yeah, users that are on direct fill win more than users that use one group per contest. Like that's not correct. But what can happen here, right, is if a user likes to use a lot of exposures, well, direct fill can actually be better for them because it's giving them one big group with one big number of lineups, whereas a user using one group per contest is getting more groups with smaller number of lineups, and the exposures being set are going to each group individually, and it can actually be harder for the builder to meet those exposures. And then there's user uses all contests in one group where they effectively duplicate lineups across contests. That's an okay approach. It's higher variance because you're using a lower total number of unique lineups. but some users like to play that way, right? So there's nothing that says like one is better than the other. You just have to understand the differences between them and pick the one that best serves what you're doing. For more info on these, you can go to our support library, and how lineup groups and templates work is a good follow-up video to watch. That'll just, break that down again, and you can easily reference it from time to time. It's also a written article. So, some people don't like to watch or listen. They like to read, which is totally cool. Well, this section has table of contents, screenshots, write-ups. It'll break down the 3 options and give you some more insight, and you can go at your own pace. So I would also recommend checking that out if you're looking for more info on those things. All right. Next question. Good afternoon, Andrew. When using Geomean for NBA DFS, how do you ensure you're not leaving out valuable lineups? Good question. So I personally wouldn't use Geomean for NBA DFS. I don't think duplication matters is so high. Maybe it is, or maybe it is like in your scenario, right? I think we've done some flashback stuff where like some users do have a high duplication rate. So I think it's okay to experiment with. I wouldn't be too aggressive with it, I guess, is maybe what I should have led with, is like, don't be hyper aggressive with it. Just kind of use it to trim, some of the highest Geomean lineups out. I wouldn't be, chopping off like 50% of my pool or anything like that. For Geomean in NBA, there's a couple things I would be super conscious about. Number one is, for my ownerships, I would standardize the lowest owned players. So like all these guys that are 0, whatever, I would change these all to 1. Change them all to 1, because then the Geomean, if it's 0, it's going to be 0. Like Geomean is a multiplication problem, and anytime you multiply by 0, the answer is 0. So you want to standardize these players all to 1, in my opinion. Second important thing is that after the slate locks, make sure, so the Geomean goes off of the values in the my own column. Well, if somebody gets rolled out and you do not change your ownership from flagship MME to say flagship MME live, you're going to effectively be applying Geomean with stale ownership. And that could actually end up hurting you. So what I would do is, if I were using Geomean in late swap, I would absolutely be changing to flagship MME live own. And then I would still, again, within the live own, be standardizing the ownerships of the lowest owned players. So keep that in mind. I think that is the most important thing when using Geomean, is understanding that ownership can change drastically after a slate locks. Let's say the slate today, okay, slate starts, all of a sudden LeBron is like a late scratch. Well, LeBron was projected for 50% ownership. That ownership has to go somewhere. It's going to change a lot of the ownership on the slate. So just be mindful of what you are using to calculate that Geomean to start with. So that's what I would say for NBA. All right, next question. On that last note, Andrew, what is the difference about diversifying one group compared to diversifying by contest? Would there be more overlap using one group per contest? So the only things that come to mind here are that when you have the avoid duplicates across lineup groups toggle on, right? So we're never going to duplicate within a group. So if all the contests are within one group, then there's going to be no duplicates. But if we had like 2 groups with 10 lineups each, for instance, and we had this toggle off, well, we could actually see duplicates across these 2 groups, right? So 2 groups with avoid duplicates across lineup groups on will give you the same amount of unique lineups as if you had one group with all of the lineups. So I think that is where this toggle comes into play. Me personally, I like to leave it off. I always say that if you're using ROI, you should be more inclined to leave it off. But if you're using Saber Score or Portfolio, then I would be more inclined to leave it on. And the reason for that is that there was only one Saber Score. But as far as ROI goes, each contest's ROI is effectively a completely different sorting metric. So in that case, I'm a little bit more inclined to allow some overlap between my groups. So that is where this toggle will come into play. Just a consideration. Next question. Explain what Flagship MME Live does when chosen in the field lineup contest. Yeah, so, going back to the LeBron example, right? The Flagship MME ownership is the pre-lock ownership. Once the slate locks and any additional sim runs, any player gets ruled out, any player gets announced starting that wasn't expected to, we update the ownership. However, we do not update the pre-lock ownership. We effectively create a new ownership set that we call Flagship MME Live. And you can see this if you go back to a past slate. So I'm going back to yesterday. I go to the My Own column, and we see the Flagship MME Live. So the Flagship MME Live behaves different on DraftKings versus FanDuel. This is also an important thing to understand. On DraftKings, we pull in actual contest data. So we know what the actual ownership was for any player on the slate. So when this first game locks, okay, so for instance, we have the ownership pre-slate for, say, Washington. Well, when the slate locks, we get the actual ownership for these players. Hey, Will Riley was 14% projected, but he actually came in 3% owned, and a lot of people did not play him. We use these actual ownerships to rebuild the ownership for the rest of the slate. So once these games lock, we pull in that ownership. We say, hey, these are all the actual ownerships. There's this much ownership left on the slate. There are these many positions. Let's rebuild ownership for the rest of the slate. Imagine we are getting pieces of the puzzle. Ownership is this big puzzle. We're getting some ownership. We're getting puzzle pieces as the games lock. And then that allows us to create a better picture of what the ownership will look like for the rest of the slate, since we got some of those puzzle pieces. So that's what Flagship MME Live is doing on DraftKings. On FanDuel, we do not get the actual ownership projections. FanDuel doesn't allow us to access those. So what would happen on FanDuel is that we would lock the ownership for the players who have started. We would lock them. And then we would say, hey, if something else happens, hey, we can rebuild the ownership for the rest of the games. We can shift it around. But we cannot adjust the players who have locked, regardless of what their actual ownership is. Their ownership projection stays the same at that point. So that's what happens on FanDuel. Follow-up to this question is, so we need to change that in the contest page field lineups. You do not. And the reason you do not is because when you go to the contest tab and you go to the field lineups and you click this gear icon has these two toggles: use live fields, use live sims. So effectively, when the live data is available, we will opt to use it automatically. So you do not have to tell us to use it. We know that you want to use it because it's more accurate and it's valuable. So we just automatically use it. The only place this doesn't automatically change are the ownerships that you're viewing in the my own column. So we will use the live data in the contest sims without you telling us to. The only thing we don't change is this view in the my own. So that is the one thing that you would have to change on your own if you want to see the live ownerships. All right, next question. What is your position when using a rule aggregate to ensure lineups have at least a 330 fantasy point in 95th percentile? Good question. And Sims said, thank you. You're welcome. So I would actually recommend not using this at the moment. So this goes back to the way percentiles are calculated. So player percentiles, and we're going to go back to today, actually, because this 13-game slate, I think, is just a little slower. Okay. So these player percentiles that you see over here, right? These are calculated on a player-by-player basis. So these are the percentiles for LeBron James and LeBron James only, right? So what we're saying is 1% of the time he scores 76 or more points. 25% of the time he scores at least 57. And 50% of the time he scores over 50 points in our sims. This is what these numbers mean. So the lineup percentiles, and we'll go back to this other build where we already built some lineups. Okay, so after you run a build, you will see these lineup percentiles. If you go to Uniques 1, rank by, percentile 95. Okay, so there's a big difference between this percentile and the player percentiles. And I do have a video talking about this if you guys are interested. It is in the office hours channel and pinned messages, breaking down player and lineup percentiles. Just so you guys know, you can find it here. Anyways, keeping it going. The lineup percentiles, the way these work, okay? And you can hover over it and you can see all the percentiles. So we build the lineups first, right? Lineups get generated. After the lineup is built, we go back into the Sims and we say, hey, how did this group of players as a whole do across all the Sims that we ran when we created this lineup? That is how we get the lineup percentiles. Lineup percentiles saying, hey, 1% of the time, this lineup as a whole scores 328.25 points. 15% of the time, the lineup scores 295, et cetera, et cetera. The LeBron James percentile is only for LeBron. So LeBron's 99th percentile outcome happens 1% of the time for him. Well, if you tried to see what were the chances that this player has their 1% outcome, this person has their 1% outcome, this one, what you're doing is you're multiplying 1% by 1% by 1% by 1%. And the odds of that happening are extremely, extremely low. Lineup percentiles I'll say it again, the 99th percentile of the lineup is a 1 in 100 chance they hit this score. So think about it. You play 150 lineups, 1 to 2 of your lineups are going to have their 99th percent outcome on average, right? So the lineup percentiles are a much more attainable number than the player percentiles. Well, all of this goes back to the original question here of an aggregate rule based on percentiles. So I would say, 95th sum at least X. The problem here the reason I wouldn't use this. So rules, you need to understand rules now, right? Rules go into the lineup creation process first. We don't have lineup percentiles at that point. All we have are player percentiles. So a rule that uses percentiles like this is using the individual player percentile values. It is not using the lineup percentiles because they don't exist, because the lineup doesn't exist. So I'm of the opinion that I don't think a rule that uses 5% outcome for 8 different players is super valuable. So that is, it basically is adding them up. So it's saying, okay, if we add up the 95th percentiles of the 8 players, it must equal whatever number you have set here, is effectively how this works. I don't find that super valuable. So I'm of the opinion that I would not use it. I would rather do some type of post-build filtering with lineup percentiles if I wanted to go that route and put an emphasis on that. So I think filtering for lineup percentiles is better than a percentile aggregate rule based on individual player percentiles. So hope I didn't lose anybody there. But that is what is happening on that front. All right. Looking in office hours. Looks like we're caught up there, caught up here in the YouTube chat. Cool. Appreciate you guys tuning in. I'll be back tomorrow, Friday, 4 p.m. Eastern for our next show. So until then, everybody, take care. Good luck. Thanks. Bye.